Star Wars Outlaws on PC, we are seeing Ubisoft Massive's ultra high-tech Snowdrop engine truly going into overdrive to deliver some of the best visuals that I have seen this year. So what technological additions have Massive added over their previous game? What effect does the PC exclusive RTXDI have on the game's visuals and performance? What stuff doesn't work so well? What do the hidden Outlaw max settings do? I will go over all of that and more in this DF video covering the PC version of Star Wars Outlaws. From a tech perspective, Star Wars Outlaws heavily leverages all of the big bullet point features that made their debut last year in Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora. Ray-traced global illumination for diffuse lighting and reflections, volumetric fog, clouds and sky, and very dense current generation levels of geometric detail. Here though, in this game, I would argue that the ray-traced lighting in particular shows its advantages even greater than as found in Avatar due to the diversity of the worlds you go across in this game and the plethora of industrially produced stuff. In Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, man-made interiors were perhaps the least impressive part of that game's visual makeup. In that game, the outdoor areas were really the ones that shined the brightest. Here in Star Wars Outlaws, we see a similar dynamic time of day like we saw in Avatar, or in many other open world games, but it is important to stress that a great chunk of the game by design takes place in areas that have been built up. You know, industrial areas, habitations, mining complexes. You will often find yourself sneaking around high-tech interiors with smooth, curvy lines and polished surfaces. Or you can find yourself in grungy, low-tech areas that are overcrowded and have poor access to daylight. With dynamic lighting in games, indoor areas or areas that are heavily sheltered from sunlight are harder to light in general, as all the objects getting in the way, so to speak, make it harder to rely upon typical rasterization techniques that games have used since the last 20 years or so. Massive's usage of ray-traced global illumination and reflections here in Star Wars Outlaws makes the game's architecture actually work from a lighting perspective where it would otherwise look really awkward without ray tracing. And it enables play spaces that are rare to see in games. As an example, you have the city of Miragana on the first open world setting that you have access to. That city is built into and underneath what looks to be a giant hollowed out mountain of some sort. And many areas of that city, when you're in it, will never ever see direct sunlight due to the rock, masonry, or other constructions getting in the way. In a game that used rasterized lighting techniques, lighting such a city would be a nightmare, as all of those techniques lack the precision to make occluded areas, that means areas away from direct lighting, look good. Thanks to RTGI and RT reflections in the Massive engine though, Miragana actually works as a city in spite of the lack of direct lighting there. Here all those areas out of direct lighting still manage to look good, and the reason for that is the little bits of sky peeking through. That little bit of sky there lights the areas below, giving them a blue or gray directional light tint. And all the objects cast shadow from that skylight, grounding them into the world and making them look natural. The game objects are not hovering or glowing like you might see in a game that lacked ray-traced lighting. And thanks to ray tracing's per pixel nature, that lighting detail does not disappear no matter how small the object is you are looking at or how close the camera gets. And I think if you look at some of these images I'm showing you, it goes without saying almost that the lighting detail can create shockingly realistic looking material responses. Seriously, the Star Wars doodads and tech gubbins look incredible here. And all of this is being captured in a city that lacks direct sunlight, a scenario which is almost impossible to model with any level of fidelity using previous state-of-the-art real-time lighting techniques. The ray-traced GI in Outlaws is not only used for bounce lighting from the sun or sky or local lights, it is also extensively used for larger scale emissive lighting. In Avatar, emissive lighting was primarily used for animal or plant bioluminescence, but here it is used in sci-fi ways. For example, these alien-looking orange rocks on the wall, they glow lambently, casting very soft shadows and light across the environments and characters. This is limited to larger surfaces through the RTGI, but seeing such soft lighting in games is really rare, and I particularly love how it is used here to aid the visual design in this specific location, giving it a look you don't see often in games. In addition to great visual design achieved by ray tracing, the game likewise traces rays to make a unique soundscape. Like Avatar before it, Outlaw physicalizes the audio in the game, which makes for some neat behaviors. Like here, me closing and opening this door in the scene allows for the music to travel into the next room, thus changing how it sounds when the door is opening. Have a listen. That's pretty cool, although admittedly, these broader strokes of technology are the same things I covered in last year's Avatar, just with a Star Wars coat of paint. A very handsome coat of Star Wars paint, I must say, but not drastically different in method than what we've seen before. This is where RTXDI and Ray Reconstruction come in. These are two PC exclusive features which more significantly affect the game's visual, and are the larger visual upgrades in this game over Avatar. First, let's start with RTXDI, which is branded as RTX Direct Illumination, but as a technique is known as Restir Direct Lighting. RTXDI here replaces nearly all of the game's direct lighting, getting rid of shadow maps and making each light and its shadow ray traced. Without RTXDI, the base game here uses shadow maps and rasterized lighting for all the closest game shadows from the sun or from any of the game's artificial lights. RTXDI replaces them with ray-traced lights and ray-traced shadows, which has a large knock-on effect for the game's visuals. Let's talk about some of the simpler effects first. Being ray-traced, shadows now can accurately simulate the penumbra effect based upon light size and shape. So for an elongated tube light, like we're seeing here directly behind the main character, we can see how the shadow map on the light is ultra high res, yet it doesn't attenuate the shadow softness based upon how close the character is or how the light is shaped. With RTXDI, the shadow starts off sharp and then rapidly starts to soften. Another typical thing you can see is ray tracing solving shadow map issues. Like here, the shadow map in the vent is high res, but not high res enough. We can see obvious sawtooth edges on the shadow even though the shadow setting is maxed out here. With RTXDI, no such thing happens as the effect works on a per pixel basis, so it is soft and detailed where it needs to be. These are some typical upgrades that we often see from ray trace shadows, but Restir is actually a lot more than that. Another thing Restir does is it makes any and every light in the game shadow casting. This is just a natural byproduct of the technique. So here, as Kay fires her blaster, we can see the game spawns a point light at the muzzle. Without RTXDI, that point light is not shadow casting. This is a sensible thing to do as cube map shadows are expensive blooms in performance. With Restir, the cost of shadows is flatter, so here we get full muzzle flash shadows, which definitely help out the scene's realism. Unshadowed lights in real-time rendering make things look gamey, and Restir will take any light in the game and make it shadow casting. This emergency light here, yep, nice and shadow casting now with RTXDI on. Random little lamps in the world, yep, now they're shadow casting. As I said though, Restir does more than even this. Restir allows for lights to exist with more exotic shapes, and for those exotically shaped lights to have realistic shadows. Take these personal shields the guards use in the game. With RTXDI off, they are kind of floating over the floor, looking unsituated there. With RTXDI on, suddenly they are now reflected in the floor and also casting shadows and light into the nearby area. It may seem confusing, but RTXDI is ray tracing lights now, so it will add reflections from those lights in the game world. These area light reflections and shadows lead to just more grounded details in the world and lighting that doesn't seem out of place. RTXDI also has a capacity to add lighting on a very small scale too. See these little light doodads and buttons on these panels here? These are too small for the game's GI system to capture lighting from. But with RTXDI, even these little details can emit light onto nearby surfaces. I was shocked to see this tiny little lighting detail being added from the lights when I came across it. And that is something that would be very wastefully expensive to add in rasterization. Staying on the small scale here, RTXDI ensures that all objects in the game get the best self-shadowing possible, reflecting all the details of their base geometry. And this will apply to things that are very expensive to ray trace against, like foliage. RTXDI will ray trace against everything essentially, and this is a large break from what we saw in Avatar. In Avatar, as I showed in my video a year ago, the stuff being ray traced against was very coarse and had less geometric complexity than the world in primary view. You could easily see that in reflections in those areas where screen space reflections were not present. This was to save performance. With RTXDI, using coarser geometry like we see in Avatar would make nonsensical broken shadows. So a different BVH is used when RTXDI is on, and that contains all of the game's super high detail geometry. That makes it so RTXDI can work in the first place, and it also makes it so that RTXDI has a higher base cost just by turning it on. In a simple scene like this one, it is around 13% lower performance just to go to the low setting. But in this scene here with vegetation, it is a more sizable 21% decrease to performance. And this is just on the lowest setting. Cranking it up to ultra might see your eyes starting to water. The RTXDI option comes with 4 standard option and an extra Outlaw max setting that I will talk about later. The difference between quality levels will depend on what you are looking at. If you're looking at an indoor artificial lights shadows, the differences between low and ultra will be very small usually. Here I can't really see a difference, although there is a hefty performance cost going from low to ultra. Based on a scene like this one, you would think low is the best. But if you stick to low, you lose ray trace shadows from the sun. Those only turn on at the medium setting and higher. So now maybe you're thinking medium makes the most sense for RTXDI. But remember those tiny little light sources I showed off earlier? Yeah, those only turn on at high and above. So you'd be missing out on those smaller lighting details on medium. So now maybe you're thinking that high is the best. Except when you come across scenes with distant area light sources. Here, the RTXDI setting increases the amount of rays shot out, stabilizing the specular reflection of area light sources, making them congeal better. With Ultra here, there's far less noise in that specular reflection of the light, and we can see some more subtle shadowing beneath the power cable on the ground. In a scene like this one, Ultra is looking better than the other settings. So as you can see, there are notable upgrades with each level of RTXDI. And based upon what I can see though, I would say the best balanced preset for performance and visuals is high. Although if you're strapped for performance, medium will do. Any setting of RTXDI is going to be better than the game's standard shadow maps, so you could even go for low if you just want to upgrade those indoor shadows. With this game having so many ray traced lighting features, it then makes sense to denoise them and make them look good, and here is where DLSS ray reconstruction comes to bear. I've covered this in other titles before, and this Nvidia RTX exclusive technology looks to improve upon classical denoising by utilizing machine learning to do upscaling and denoising in one step. In practice, it has shown great promise and results, but it has its issues, and in my experience, there is a similar situation here in Outlaws, but there are some key differences. To point out the many positives first, ray reconstruction dramatically improves the quality of lighting, reflection stability, and detail, especially in motion. For shadows, take a look at the fan here. With the game's standard denoiser, the moving shadows start showing off larger ghosting effects and light lag as the shadows move. Notice how the individual fan blades in the standard denoiser become smoothed over in movement, almost disappearing into the ghosting that is occurring. Ray Reconstruction by comparison shows the movement of those fan blades in the shadow that updates per frame, with comparatively no ghosting occurring. For reflections, we see something similar. In movement, we can see here how with Ray Reconstruction off, there is a lot of noise and flicker in the reflection on the ground here. Shapes in the reflection are just not coalescing as they should. With Ray Reconstruction, noise and flicker are heavily reduced, and the shapes in the reflection break through to become visible. It is just a dramatically more stable reflection. For any static reflection, the combined upscaling and denoising makes it so that reflections look much higher res and respect surface normal detail. The water surface here, for example, no longer is overly blurred out and smeary like we see in the standard denoiser on the left. It looks like native 4K in comparison on the right in spite of the lower resolution internal rendering. For lighting and GI detail, Ray Reconstruction also absolutely triumphs over the standard denoiser, especially when it comes to inner surface detail. Take a look at Nyx and K here in this shot, and notice how much more detail there is on Nyx's head. Or notice the fine shadows under K's hands and feet. And there's a lot of other incidental detail there in Ray Reconstruction that just isn't there with the standard denoiser, especially on her hands and jacket. Lighting and normal mapped detail is much better preserved versus the standard denoiser. So in cases like these that I'm showing, which I would describe as the majority, Ray Reconstruction will greatly enhance the game's image quality. But for a number of other cases, Ray Reconstruction has some bigger issues. One of those issues can be seen in the same shot with K while it is moving. There's a lot more detail, but pay attention to K's hair here. Depending upon the color of the area behind her hair, there can be a dragging smear or trail of pixels that can be seen following the camera movement. It's subtler here than it is actually in other scenes. In other scenes that are primarily indirectly lit and dark, sometimes the trail's effect behind moving objects can be much more obvious and distracting in spite of the enhanced lighting detail that Ray Reconstruction can have. The other core issue with Ray Reconstruction in this title is one that I think I'm encountering for the first time. As we can see in the scene here, the positives of Ray Reconstruction are very visible. For example, if I pause the recording, you can see how the detail on the character's face in the background here, as well as the normal map detail on the cup they are holding, is not being smeared into oblivion like it is in the standard denoiser. Same with the little menu console in front of them. There's added blue light reflection there, and the metallic nature of the material is better preserved instead of being denoised out of existence. It looks a lot better, I would say, but let's play the video again and pay attention to the hologram. If you notice, the edges of the hologram are aliasing with Ray Reconstruction on. It is changing subtly per frame in a way that is not stable and is causing flicker to the eye. This happens with a number of edges in this title with Ray Reconstruction on. Check out the scene I showed off earlier, but this time looking at the edge of the building. The inner surface detail is way better with Ray Reconstruction, but as the camera moves, take a look at the outside edge of the building here. Notice how there is an ever undulating wavy and slightly smeared line on the edge there. The standard denoiser, in spite of its other faults, keeps that edge straight and stably anti-aliased. It is not changing per frame. Ray Reconstruction, on the other hand, has this morphing effect per frame and is causing aliasing. I think this behavior happens with a number of edge types in this game, but straight edges make it most obvious. For example, here, these beads hanging in the doorway entrance. These straight thin lines here make the issue with Ray Reconstruction and this wavy aliasing really obvious. It's almost been 1 year since Ray Reconstruction's debut, and I think issues like this and others I have shown in other titles show that the technology is due for a quality update from Nvidia. Yes, it is way better at handling inner surface detail, lighting detail, reflections, and shadows, but for edges, it has issues right now. And the issues with trails and aliasing in this title can overshadow the positives depending upon the scene you are in. So I have trouble recommending it actually here due to the issues until it is updated. With that less than positive note, I want to go into some things that Outlaws does not do so well. One area where the game has issues is with its characters, and in an atypical way. In gameplay conditions, characters are incredibly detailed. Looking at the main character, if you zoom right in, the detail on her face or clothing holds up incredibly well. Combined with the tight ray traced lighting, she looks incredible, I would say, and even smaller insignificant details like her hands have great materials and textures. This applies to almost any NPC in the game too. You just zoom in on some random dude at the bar here and they look incredible. There's a lot of detail there. The character models for NPCs and enemies in this game look great under gameplay lighting conditions and when they are animating in gameplay usually. But in cutscenes, it's an entirely different story. Kate in cutscenes, for example, looks weird. She has stilted animation and the lighting is doing her no favors. She looks like a different person in cutscenes, an animatron in comparison to the lifelike looking person we see in gameplay. This is almost anti-AAA here, where in other games, cutscene characters really look a lot better than the ones in gameplay, but here the ones in gameplay look a lot better. In the grand scheme, I'm actually happy that less resources are spent on non-interactive cutscenes, but it sure is jarring at times in this game when the switch occurs. Everything just looks so stilted in comparison to the otherwise naturalistic feeling that the gameplay and game world has. Getting back to smaller things, this game also has issues with image quality in two areas. For one is aliasing and ghosting. Features like Kay's hair or the moving grass in the game never look stable. For Kay's hair, it is eternally aliased, regardless of the image quality you throw at it. For the grass or other fine vegetation features, they can look smeary and aliased in a less than pleasant way. Perhaps this has something to do with motion vector quality, but Outlaws has issues here in image quality where Avatar didn't seem to have them. Another image quality issue comes from the game's post-processing. As my footage in the game shows so far, you've probably noticed the constant blur and lens barrel distortion around the screen edges. This is coupled with film grain and chromatic aberration, which leads to a distinctly soft image. You can of course turn off film grain and chromatic aberration, but trying to turn off other lens effects has issues. If you adjust the cinematic effects quality option, going down to medium and lower does seem to get rid of the constant unfocused pixel look at the center of the image. This would be recommendable, but in motion, this option is bugged, as we can see in the comparison here. The medium setting and lower have these semi-transparent horizontal lines that are dashing across the image roughly every 20 pixels. This leads to big aliasing that shouldn't be there. It's like some effect is broken and not working correctly, and it doesn't look good. As I see it, the game should make it so that all lens effects and post-processing are separately toggleable for users, so they can get an unfiltered image if they like. Lens flares, bloom, barrel distortion, and more should all just be separate options here, just like chromatic aberration and motion blur are. Beyond this, I did notice some other smaller things that I wish were different. Some water effects in the game appear to move at a low frame rate, and I'm not sure why, like the ripples in this larger puddle here. Motion blur in the game is good, but strangely it doesn't seem to apply to the main character's movement. Perhaps this is intentional, but her movement looks so much framier than the other movement in the game. And lastly, glass is not commonly found in the game world here, but it sticks out more than it should because glass in this game is shaded with a semi-real-time cube map system. As I move around this glass we're seeing here in the spaceship, you should notice that the reflection on it is slowly updating as it adjusts to the new perspective of the camera. It kind of works, but it is at odds with the other high fidelity aspects of the presentation here. Given the wealth of ray tracing here, I wish glass had ray traced reflections like water does. And my last complaint here is with the ray traced reflections. They are fine enough in game, but like in Avatar, they still do not use ultra high quality objects and materials in them. When the camera moves and things go out of screen space, you will see how objects still use averaged materials, lacking any texture detail. That's fine enough for rough reflections, but on mirror-like surfaces such as water and more, it is really obvious that SSR is doing a lot of heavy lifting. That's why you see such discontinuities with SSR in this game. It is important to note as well that if you are using the Ultra setting, you will see that characters disappear from reflections out of screen space, along with smaller things like plants. This in spite of the fact that RTXDI in the game is tracing against everything. Basically, I really wish there was a reflection option that gave the reflections out of screen space higher texture and material quality, and also added in the objects that RTXDI is tracing against. It would be the cherry on top of an otherwise gorgeous ray tracing implementation. Yes, it would be expensive, but it would be even more forward-looking. Speaking of forward-looking, just like Avatar, by using this command line argument here for the game, you can unlock the hidden Outlaw preset, which adds one higher tier preset for a number of settings, either allowing them to go to Ultra or Max depending upon the setting. Here, most of the differences from these settings will be small and are not recommended for modern GPUs, rather for future ones. As an example, you have the setting to increase volumetric quality. I think when looking at these side by sides here, you'll struggle to see the difference between high, ultra, and max in the scene, despite volumetric fog being right front and center. Similarly, the added ultra setting for diffuse reflections shows little changes. In this scene here, you have to look in the corners to see that there's more occlusion there. Hard to see, but there's an added expense. The two options I saw most noticeably different were RTXDI and specular reflections. With RTXDI, the core difference comes from lighting stability. If you go back to that scene I showed off earlier, there we can see how unlocked max settings adds further definition and stability to the light in the distance here. So that setting could be useful down the road. Same with the unlocked max specular reflection setting, where this one interestingly adds characters into ray traced reflections. Here you will see 11% performance cost in this scene as the Stormtrooper is added to reflections outside of screen space. This makes him not disappear there and makes the SSR issues less obvious. Same with this animal here. It disappears out of screen space on Ultra, but it is there on the max setting. So some of the settings here will help with image quality in the game and are great for scaling future GPUs, but I definitely do not recommend them right now unless you want the best IQ possible with the lowest frame rate possible. Speaking of frame rates, this is the last topic I want to talk about here in this video. A future video will talk more about performance along with optimized settings, but here I just want to talk about frame time stability. It is generally very good in Star Wars Outlaws, and there doesn't appear to be any shader compilation stutter, but there are two big flaws with performance and frame time stability right now that are linked to RTXDI. The first is that there are pockets in the game world where, when RTXDI is on, the GPU load increases ridiculously by 2.5 times or more, as we can see here with me on the speeder bike. Just moving slightly forward towards this rock cluster and grass sees the frame rate plummet into oblivion. There's scarcely a difference of what's being rendered on screen, yet performance turns into unplayable territory. These little zones are scattered across the open world, and they make RTXDI a lurching performance mess when you run into them. Another issue that may or may not be related is that RTXDI can have worse frame time stability. When running through Mirogana, you can see little frame time spikes to around 33.3 milliseconds or so that are not found there with RTXDI off. Perhaps this is related to the other issue. It's not too bad, really, but it is far from ideal. I really would like clean frame times. The issue is that the frame time instability can be inconsistent. Sometimes, as we're seeing here on the speeder bike, turning on RTXDI can lead to a much larger and extremely distracting frame time spike when traversing the game world, in the realm of 150 milliseconds on an RTX 4090 Ryzen 7 7800X3D. It feels awful when these frame time spikes happen. Like I said though, there's not a great consistency to it. I've ran the same benchmark multiple times and I get different results. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Like here, as the bridge is being crossed, we can see the exact same wave-like undulations to frame time occurring there, but on the second run, there is no massive stutter occurring, unlike there is in the first run. The primary issue is that RTXDI, when on, leads to unstable frame times. It is flaky. Sometimes it's really bad, and sometimes it's acceptable. Either way, it needs fixing for RTXDI to become viable to be turned on. It needs to have smooth frame times. As of right now, that is definitely not the case. Getting to the end of this video here, I find Star Wars Outlaws an incredible looking game. I think Massive have made something special here that is visually right up there with the best things we've seen this console generation. I also want to praise the fact that Outlaws allows powerful PCs to stretch their legs and not be artificially limited by console technology. It's nice to see a game that looks a lot better on PC because the developer gives the users forward-looking tech that PCs have. So there's greatness here, but there's also serious polish issues at launch. In spite of its obvious quality wins, ray reconstruction needs to be updated by either Nvidia or Massive to become more viable, to prevent the trails behind objects, and to stabilize geometric edges to prevent that wavy aliasing. RTXDI needs to have its frame time issues ironed out. And for the game in general, there needs to be better image quality somehow. one step in that direction is giving people better control over cinematic effects to clean it up. So this game is looking like it needs to get some patches to be in a better state, after which I think this would be one of the best, if not the best, PC release this year. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, like, subscribe, ring the bell, help us on Patreon, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!